Hi everyone and welcome back to Story of the World Highlights. Today we'll be discussing chapter 21. Now 21 takes us to North America and covers different wars that were happening right before the American Revolution. It's broken into two parts, first talking about some pointless wars that happened, and part 2 talking about the 7 Years' War. So let's get started with those 3 pointless wars. The 3 pointless wars that our chapter tells us about are as follows. Number 1 was King William's War, or at least that's what the colonists were calling it, because the colonists were mostly British, and their king at the time was King William of William and Mary, as you remember. This war, though, originally started in Europe, and this war was called the War of the Grand Alliance. Alliance just means team, joining together to fight against a common enemy. Now, this Grand Alliance was made up of England, the Netherlands, and Austria. Now, why were they joining together? Well, it's because our very own son, King Louis XIV, as you remember, was very land hungry, and he kept trying to expand France's borders. So the 3 of them joined up together to try and stop him from expanding. And remember, colonies are owned by their main country. And so if your main country is fighting, you must fight too. And so we saw the French and the English in the New World starting to fight with each other. The English hired the Iroquois to burn French settlements. The French knew that this was secretly the English, so they went and burned English settlements. And it just went back and forth, until finally they gave up fighting. And nothing happened. No land was traded. No one won anything. It just ended. And so that's why it was pointless. Moving on, a few years later, we have what was known in the Americas as Queen Anne's War. Again, named by the British people in the colonies after their queen or king at the time. And at that time, it was Queen Anne. Now, Queen Anne was the little sister of Queen Mary. Mary and William died without a son or daughter to take over. So we had Anne being queen now. This war started again in Europe before it got to the colonies. And this war was called the War of Spanish Succession. So our son King Louis XIV, his grandson was able to get claim to the Spanish throne and became Philip II of Spain. Now, because he was able to claim access to the Spanish throne, that meant that France had influence with Spain. And that meant that France was getting bigger in their power and influence. And as we remember from the first pointless war, Europe didn't like that. So people were again fighting to stop the French from getting bigger. And this, of course, then spread to the colonies. And again, there was lots of fighting. And a few years later, they gave up fighting again with no winner. So it was pointless. The third of these pointless wars happened a long time after. So Queen Anne died, no children. Then a great-great-grandson of James I, who was living in Germany at the time, came in. And during George I's reign as king, there was no fighting. But when his son, George II, became king, there was something that happened in Europe that caused them all to go back to war. And that happened to do with the Holy Roman Empire. So the Holy Roman Emperor had died, and he did not have a clear heir to his power. And so a lot of different people in the Holy Roman Empire were fighting and arguing to try and be the next Holy Roman Emperor. Now, England said, I really like the Austrian guy. The Austrian guy should be it. And France said, no, Austria already has so much power. And so France decided to pick a fight with England. And somebody was already fighting England at the time. And that was Spain. Spain had been fighting England over a silly thing regarding 2 of their sea captains abroad. Apparently, the English sea captain Jenkins claimed that a Spanish sea captain had cut off his ear for no reason. And the English were not going to let the Spanish terrorize their captains. So they were already fighting in a war that was known as the War of Jenkins Ear. And because they were already fighting, and France wanted to start fighting England, France joined Spain. So now it was Spain and France against England. Now, Austria said, whoa, 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 2 against 1, that's not fair. So they joined on England's side to help support England. Now, Prussia also wanted in on this and decided to join France and Spain against Austria and England. So now we just have so many different European countries all fighting each other. And of course, what happens in Europe spreads to their colonies. And so in the Americas, they started to have a war again. This time it was called King George's War, named after George II. And they were fighting and burning each other's villages down, and it kept going. And again, when it ended, no one won anything. It was pointless again, and it ended. So in summary, war in Europe meant a war in the Americas. America had different names for these wars, and they were all pointless. That's all you need to know about the first part of this chapter. Well, let's move on to the second part of this chapter. The second part of this chapter covers the 7 Years' War. The 7 Years' War is also known in America as the French and Indian War. Now, the reason it's called the French and Indian War is because, remember, we used to call Native people Indians because Christopher Columbus thought he landed in India. And the French and the Native peoples joined together in this war against the English. And so this war was known as the French and Indian War. Now, it all started because there was an unclaimed piece of land next to Pennsylvania called the Ohio River Valley. And the Ohio River Valley was a really rich place because it had lots of great resources that could make a country rich. Lots of great trees, just the area was great for farming. It was all around great. And no one had claimed it. And one day, the French started going down south into this valley and were spotted by some other colonists in Pennsylvania, right next door. So one of the governors wrote to King Charles II and said, oh, king, the French, they're starting to come in on this land. We don't want them to have it, right? And the king said, of course not. We don't want them to have that. So he said, send them a letter telling them to get away. So he sent him a letter. And the person to deliver this letter was a volunteer from Virginia named George Washington. Yes, the very one. And George Washington bravely, with a guide, walked across and delivered this message to the French commander in the Ohio River Valley. And the French commander read the letter that said, please stop. And he looked at George Washington and he laughed in his face. He wasn't going to stop. This little boy comes with this letter. He's not going to stop. So George went back to tell his governor about this. And on his way back, the French had had a native person try and kill him. It was a treacherous journey back. Treacherous meaning dangerous and scary. And when he finally got back to the governor, he was like, not only was I laughed at, but I also was almost killed. So the governor wrote to England and said, we need support. Please send troops. We'll try and build a fort and hold it down and make sure no one gets in here. But we need help. Pronto. Please come. Now. And so he sent that. And while they were waiting for support to come from England, they went and built a fort right in this really prime location in the Ohio River Valley where 3 rivers connected. So they said, oh, that's a perfect spot for a fort. So 40 men went out and they built a fort quickly there. But there was only 40 men at the time. They were waiting for more soldiers. And the French were there with lots and lots of troops and native people to help them. So the French easily took over the fort and defeated the 40 men. But by this time, we also had support, reinforcements coming in from England. Now, these reinforcements, they had snazzy uniforms. They were ready to just easily defeat the French. But one thing that they weren't prepared for was that fighting in the Americas was a lot different than fighting in Europe. The Americas were very wooded and had lots of mountains. And so they were not prepared to fight in that environment. Now, the French who had been there and their native allies were well prepared. So, of course, England didn't do so well at first. The French were easily destroying them. But finally, the English figured out that maybe we don't want our red coats to be an easy target in the woods. And they flipped their coats inside out. And they said, our shiny new weapons, they're easy to spot. Let's make them dirty. And once they started to pick up on these strategies, they were able to finally win against the French. And at the end of this war, we have the Sun King's grandson, Louis XV. He was sick and dying, and he was just exhausted of this war because he had his health concerns and other things. And he just said, you can have our land in the north, New France, Quebec, yeah, just take it. However, we will keep the Louisiana Territory, which was a big piece of land that went from where the border of America and Canada is today, all the way down to New Orleans in the south, near Texas. So that whole big piece of land, France kept, but the rest of it they just gave up at the end of this. And that is why he is greatly hated by the French people as one of their worst kings, who just gave up all this land to the English, who they hate. And that was the end of our first chapter 21, and our first wars that we really had before the Revolutionary War. I'll see you next time for chapter 22. Bye, everyone.